Here, I just want to make you aware of these couple of settings that we have in image editor nodes and of course texture layers, the pixel blending and use mipmaps option. What you can see I've got here, I've just got some image or other that's been loaded up into a backdrop environment, which is lower resolution than the backdrop environment really, needs to look nice and clean. And as you can see, it's very pixelated. Now this is something you can get if you do load a backdrop environment that's too low res to really fill your screen, or of course if you load a texture onto an object, onto a mesh and a surface, and you have a close-up of it where of course the number of pixels making up your view is greater than the number of pixels in that area of the image texture. There's really only two things you can do about this. Either use higher resolution images, which sometimes can lead to needing very large images, which might be unmanageable. And the second is to use the pixel blending option here, which you can see is just sort of a small level pixel blur that smooths things out. When you are using images like this for backdrop lighting and so on, pixel blending is more than adequate to improve them enough. It might not be good enough to actually have them as a rendered backdrop, in which case you'd want to use a higher resolution version as the backdrop, or of course have a still image that was high resolution. And as for the case of textures on surfaces, an awful lot of the time what you will have is of course you'll have multiple layers of textures in the colour, in the specular, in the bump and so on, which will be helping to break one another up. And in those instances you'll find that pixel blending will keep you sorted out the vast majority of the time. As long as you're not using ridiculously low resolution texture images, you will find that you would have to go very close up before things started to look wrong and clearly like blurry texture. You'll find that in general this comes on by default, and it is useful most of the time to leave it on. So let's look at mipmaps. Here I have a piece of geometry with a stonework, brickwork texture on it here, and if we turn to the side like this and let's bring our camera in, we can see quite plainly what is happening at a distance. You see that our texture is becoming blurry there. Here it's nice and sharp, but as we're moving further away from the camera it's becoming quite horribly blurry. In fact, of course, if we do render this, we see that it's not simply an OpenGL sort of error or affair that's going on. It is actually completely wrong in the image once rendered. As we see there, it's really rather unattractive and unappealing. This is the result of mipmapping. What mipmapping attempts to do is it attempts to scale the resolution of your images to better fit with how much resolution they're occupying in your rendered view. This is useful for anti-aliasing textures, as if you have a high resolution texture and it's far away in terms of the camera view, then of course you have more pixels of texture than you have pixels of render. In other words, the texture has taken on sub-pixel detail. Having that can produce a challenge for anti-aliasing. It can require higher anti-aliasing levels to clean up, and so on. Mipmapping attempts to fix this essentially at the texture level. You can see, of course, how this appearance improves if we come, for instance, to the image editor here, find the offending images, and we turn off Use Mipmaps. We wind up with much sharper detail. Obviously here it might seem like you just do not want to use mipmap. However, the fact of the matter is that mipmaps have two different versions that are available. You can see that the images have just been applied in the normal texture layer editor here. The T layer uses one mipmapping method, which is very poor. However, if we go into nodes and we use one of the image nodes instead, then we can turn the mipmaps back on, and whilst the OpenGL appearance doesn't appear greatly different, we find that of course the render is far different, and the mipmapping we can see is well behaved and we're getting lovely detailed textures even at a distance. You can of course still choose not to use the mipmaps if you so prefer. In this case it's a trivial example, so it hasn't made much difference to the anti-aliasing. But in other cases where you've got a lot of fine detail in the texture, that may well not be the case. But otherwise, ordinarily, you will find that the mipmaps in the image nodes here do give you the kind of results that you really desire from the mipmapping. And of course, if you want it, somewhere between the two, you can always, of course, alter the mipmap strength here, which will reduce the softening somewhat at a distance like this. Do notice that this is also a feature of the texture layer editor. So even if you're in Nodal, but you are using the texture layer nodes, then they are using the texture layer mip mapping, which of course off here looks fine, but when we have that on, then we are getting this same blurry effect at a distance like that, which is of course not what we want. So be aware that when bringing in assets from earlier versions of Lightwave, those that have used the texture layer here to add a texture, an image map, you really want to turn mip mapping off or convert over to using the direct image nodes themselves, in which case you can quite happily use the mip map workflow without getting this softening in your textures.